Hello and welcome to Chelsea Black Community Black History Month 2021. Our national theme is Family, Leadership, and Service. Tonight is our first event. It's our first virtual Zoom event, and it is on the feature Life of Fannie Cary Fairweather. It will be reported by historian Karen McGinnis. Karen is a museum professional with more than 25 years of experience. Karen spent 20 years working for the Marblehead Museum of Collection Manager and Curator, where her research assistance provided historical accuracy for movie and multimedia presentations, numerous exhibits, exhibit catalogs, and over 24 publications. Karen served 2 terms with the historic Beverly's Board of Directors and has spent many years as a Salisbury Public Library trustee and archivist. Her involvement with the Governor Bellingham Cary House Association began in 2005, and she is currently the president of the board of directors. Karen's research on Fairy Cary Fairweather is an ongoing project. Welcome and enjoy the evening.
That was an area that in letters back and forth to the family, that was a little play area for the children at the Cary house because there were lots of willows there. And so there was nothing there between the house and all the way to the marsh, all the way beyond Broadway. There was nothing behind the house. It was a farm. There was an apple orchard that went up part of Powderhorn Hill. There was a spring on the back of Powderhorn Hill that they were able to get water. They had marshland. They had dikes to control the tides. They had sheep, cows. There was a farmer who lived on there. And Mr. and Mrs. Cary had 15 children. 2 died very, very young, within days, when they lived in the West Indies. But that house has been full of people and children and activity. A lot of people were born in that house, and a lot of people, including Fannie Fairweather, died in that house. So it's an incredible part of history. So if you can just imagine, that's the setting. It wasn't sold off, the land wasn't sold off into development and house lots until the 1850s. So it was well after Cary had passed. The other thing I just want to mention before I talk about Fannie is, this isn't my story, this is Fannie's. And I and many others have been drawn to her story. And the more I learn about her, the more fascinating I find it. So some of the words that I use in doing the research, I'm not really even comfortable with, but it may be a listing from 1798 when they got married, or a census from 1810. That's part of the historical record. So I just wanted to say that. Okay, a brief bio of Fannie, touch points, and then I'll go into the broader aspect of her life and some of the historical facts that we have, that we know about her. Fannie was born free in Africa, probably West Africa, we don't know, but probably West Africa. She was captured by slavers. Now, a lot of this information comes from letters within the family. Some have been privately published. Some are at the Mass Historical, some are privately held. But Fannie talked about remembering as a little girl being captured. Men came out of the woods. She was taking care of her little sister, and men came out of the woods and took her. Was it white slavers? Was it black slavers? In a sense, it doesn't matter, because she was stolen. She was stolen from her family and where she was from. The story then goes that she was in the slave market at St. Kitts. Well, St. Kitts and Grenada aren't in exactly the same place. So again, we're not quite sure. There's so many other things we have to learn. But at any rate, she was 8, 10 years old. We're figuring that she lived, she was born in 1764. So she was purchased in Grenada. She visited with in Chelsea with the Cary family in the 1780s and then came back with them in 1791 and lived in Chelsea until she died in 1844. She came here in 17, she came to Chelsea in 1791. She married David Fairweather, who was listed as a free black of Boston. And they got married in Chelsea and they lived in Chelsea. Very little is known about him. I have some threads out there. I think I know who his family was, but I want to be sure. And anyway, this is about Fannie. So they had 15 years together. They got married in 1798, and David died in Chelsea, probably in what is called the slave house on John Street. I'm not really comfortable calling it that, but that's what it is known as. And he is listed in the census as the head of the household. So she died she was widowed in 1813 after 15 years of marriage. She died in 1844 and was buried probably in the Rumney Marsh Cemetery, which was part of North Chelsea then. I don't believe that she would have been buried in the Cary family crypt, which all the Carys have been moved to the Rumney Marsh Cemetery as well. So, but at any rate, she is there. Now, that's her life shortly. Again, we don't have anything directly from Fannie. And here's what a historian, what a researcher finds interesting, but also you have to contend with it. Are these stories true? Because we've heard stories. Who do we have the record from? We have the record from her owners, her employers, people who she lived with. So it's secondary. It's not her speaking. Are the stories real, or are they just, oh yes, we bought Fannie and we took care of her and wasn't that lovely, to make themselves feel good about having this human being with them? I don't know. But I do know that in history, most stories are based in fact. And I have been able to identify some things that I can prove that Fannie really was where she was. Okay, to broaden it a little bit, Fannie talked about her being stolen. And Mrs. Cary saw her, felt really sad about this little child, this little girl being there, and said, I must have that child. Now, that's uncomfortable to say that, but that's how the story goes. Again, it's the granddaughter of Mrs. Cary saying that. But at any rate, she came as a young girl. She, I'm sure, was helped take care of the Cary children. But she lived with them for the rest of her life. Now, here's where it gets a little interesting, and I hope to have questions about this, and I've checked the legal aspect of this with our legal advisor on the board. But here's food for thought. The family came back to Chelsea in 1784 and stayed for 2 months on Parker Street. Fannie came with them. Well, my conjecture is when she stepped off the boat in Boston in 1784, she was a free woman. Slavery had been abolished in Massachusetts in the early 1780s. Now, it still went on, but I have the court cases. There were 2 major court cases that were argued in the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. uh, three actually, Black people took their former owner, as it were, to court and said, no, no, the Constitution, the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 says we're free. They said, we don't think so. And the people took them to court and won. So to me, when Fannie stepped off the boat in 1784, she was free. But they stayed in Chelsea for 2 months, and Mrs. Cary's mother taught Fannie to read. So 1784-85, they lived here. They went back to Grenada, and then they came back permanently in 1791. So again, I think they brought three of their Black quote unquote servants, they're called, who were slaves in Grenada. But my feeling is that the minute they stepped off the boat, they were legally free. Now, we don't know whether the Carys ever paid them. We have not as yet. We may find. We have not as yet found any evidence of any listing of pay for their work. We don't know that. But they came back in 1791. Fannie and David got married in Chelsea. And then we checked the census. And there have been a federal census in the United States every 10 years since 1790. And the ones for Boston and Chelsea are missing. They've gone, so I can't find yet David listed in 1790 or 1800. And they only list the head of the family. And they do list whether they're white, Black, and their ages. So in 1810, David is listed as being the head of the household, and there were three other people of color, Black people, living with him. He's listed right under Samuel Cary's property. So it seems to lead to the fact that they were living at what is known as the slave house. They weren't living in the house, but they were living in the slave house. But he's listed as head of the family. 1810. He dies 1813. I have no idea where he was buried. Hopefully they're together, but I don't know. Then from then on, she's listed as the head of the household in the census of 1820 and 1830. And that's when the story comes about. If you are at the Cary house and you go down onto Parker Street, right where Tudor Street comes, right at that corner there. Before there was a street there, the records say that that's where Fannie Fairweather's little cottage was, and they would visit her. So she was there, and then supposedly she was taken again, the letters from the Cary family, when she became too frail to live by herself. She came and stayed with the two Cary sisters who cared for her as a loving member until she died. Well, that's all very nice, but did she really? Well, yes, I believe she did. Because in 1840, a woman of color between 55 and 100 was living in the Cary house with Charles Cary and the two sisters. So I think she was. I think she was there. Does anybody have any questions or anything to say so far? I don't want to go on and on without asking people if they have any questions.
Did she have any children?
No, I have not found anything, any indication that she had any children. No, wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't that be wonderful?
Yes.
I I I don't want to say too much because I'm not sure. And there's always oh, I would like it if it were so, you know. But David, I think David was one of 6 children in Boston. And I think his father owned property. It's hard but rewarding. Again, and this is uncomfortable, but it's the fact. You can't just look in the F's. in the Boston Directory for 1790 or whatever and find the Fairweathers. They're in a separate section, which is annoying, but that's how it was. And sometimes they're listed as Negroes, sometimes they're Blacks. If they paid tax, then there's more of a record. So finding more about David's family and finding more about David is really part of the quest, as it were. You get just enough information to keep you going and asking more questions. But this is what I personally find so fascinating is we all just put a label, an adjective on somebody. Oh, she was a slave, or she was this, or she was that. He was a carpenter, or whatever. And it's people are more than that. And I love the fact the intellectual, ethical. Well, was she free? I think she was. So you have this woman who was born free, taken from her family, enslaved, became free, got married, lived her life, and died a free woman in the house that we
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi, Karen. It's Toad.
Totally.
Yeah, it's past my bedtime, but I'm here.
From Portugal. Oh my God.
She was hi. She was bought as a slave, right? By the Carys. Yeah. Yes. Okay. I just wanted to clarify that.
I must tell people this is Todi Cesar. She is calling from, I'm going to cry. She is a friend. She lives in Portugal and she has done, she's a friend of the Chapmans and the Cary House and has done incredible work at the Cary House. In fact, one of her triumphs is the Lafayette Mirror. And we thank you, Todi. So yes, what do you have to say? Tell us more.
Well, no, that was it. I just wasn't sure if they took her because they liked her or they had actually bought her as a slave.
They did, and that, you know, again, the granddaughter in the Cary letters that was privately printed, the family story goes that Miss Cary was there and said to her husband, because of the sad demeanor of this child, I must have that child. Well,
but they exchanged money for her.
Right. And that's one of the things that, and that's the other thing, Toad, that when Mrs. Cary joined her husband, she left Chelsea in January of 1774 after she had their first child. She couldn't leave out of Boston because it was frozen, so the harbor was frozen. So she traveled to Newburyport, sailed from Newburyport in January 1774 down to Grenada. So the story sounds as if Fannie was purchased, as it were, soon thereafter. Mm-hmm. So, and it fits with the fact that when Fannie died, she's listed as being 80 years old. And that's the other thing that speaks so deeply to me. And Todi, you may know this, you may not. But in the vital records of Chelsea, in 1844, when she died, in parentheses, it reads, native of Africa. And I have not seen every death record, of course, but I've never seen that I consider an honorific, that this woman was a native of Africa. So if she were 80 years old in 1844, she would have been born in 1764. And if they bought her in 1774, she would have been about 10. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could find more information? I would love to know, you know, where she came from. I don't know. There's never any mention of what her name was or anything, just that she remembered being taken. So that's it.
I have a question.
Yes. Oh, hello, David.
Hey, you talked about they came to Chelsea and then went back to Grenada and then came back, and I think it's 1791. Can you talk about what was going on that sort of made them come back and everything? Why they left Grenada?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Mrs. Cary, in the letters, I'm not sure exactly. Grenada was hotly contested between the French and English constantly. Their property that they owned, Simon Plantation, was on the northeast part of the island, but he also managed a plantation on the northwest side of the island. So he was away a lot. So I don't know exactly. It's not made clear exactly whether it was intention, whether it was Samuel's health. Mrs. Cary writes in the Cary letters that along the lines that men come to the islands and think they'll make their something along this. They'll come to the islands and think they'll make their fortune and then go home within a few years. And there's something about this place that keeps them hoping. So she wanted to go home, and he didn't.
Do you know what kind of plantation they had?
Yes, they had. Oh, I'm going to get it wrong, Tody. They had one was sugar, and then the other one that they I believe that he was managing Mount Pleasant. It was coffee, and the wording is he caused it to be changed to sugar.
So they were involved in the triangular trade.
Oh, sure. Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And one of the resources, and this is something that will be, we're updating our website, the association, and I want to have a Fannie Fairweather page to have a bibliography, as it were, so other people can look at the things. One of the things that are already on the web is one of Samuel's letter books. And it's online, available to anyone. It's Samuel Cary's letter book, and you can see scanned copies of the pages from the 1760s, 1772. Some of which you can read, some of which you can't. But it's held by a special collection in the University of Florida. And in it, he mentions you can read some of it selling. He doesn't say slaves. He usually says the Negroes. That is the terminology he uses at that time. So, and to David's question, the unrest in the area grew, and when the Carys came back, they had lost everything basically in the insurrection in 1795-96. And that's another thing I want to say, that you know, they were not fabulously wealthy. They had money. But some of their family members were wealthy. They were elite, but and they were of privilege, but they weren't fabulously wealthy, swanning around Grenada and New England. So I hope that answers your question, David. Part of it, anyway.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Karen, do you know what the dollar amount was for the purchase of Fannie?
No.
And she was 10 years old, you think, at the time when she came?
Yeah. Hi. No, that's one of the. I would love to know. It would mean a great deal, I think, if we knew what ship she came over, because there is a transatlantic slave database, which you're probably aware of, and also it's through the National Archives in Kew in London. They have a lot of things online that if we knew when she came either to St. Kitts or Grenada, what ship she came on, that would indicate where did she sail from. And I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Great job.
Sir. Thank you. More information, that's all.
Hi, Karen.
Hello, how are you?
Hi,
How are you? Oh, the parrot and the feathers. Yes. How
but
are you?
in hearing this story, parts of which, of course, are very familiar to me,
Right.
I began wondering about the legality of marriage. Were enslaved people at the time that Fannie and David married,
Right.
was that legal, or is that a sign that she was free because her marriage was recorded? Is that something?
That's a fabulous question. It really is a fabulous question, and it's a good one to ask. It's one I had never thought of, which is one reason why it's a good question to get that other input. Yes, they would still be listed even in the early 1700s. It's very rewarding to find it, but the difficulty is these people were not given a last name. So you can't, so the earlier, if you look at in fact, it brings up a good point. The earlier, the typewritten records of Boston, records of whatever, they will say Scipio, servant of Fairweather.
Yeah.
So he didn't have a name, but his owner did. Now, what happens sometimes if that individual, we're saying Scipio, there was a Scipio Fairweather, if he was sold, then usually his surname would change, which is horrendous. But it makes it more difficult to track them. So in answer to your question, yes, even though they were enslaved, they weren't usually called slaves. They were called servants of.
Yes.
And it would be Scipio, servant of Thomas Fairweather, and Jane, servant of Hannah Twing. Twing was a very big Boston name. That brings up another point. When you, and you know this, when in doing the research that you did when you did about Fannie, there is the typewritten word. And then there's the original documentation, which is what you always try to go for. In the typewritten area, in the typewritten notice of Fannie and David's listing in the Chelsea Vital Records or whatever, it says David Fairweather of Boston, Fannie Cary of Chelsea. And it says cold, COLD, capital C, small OLD. So, okay, so you're looking at that and say, well, what the heck is that? And then I remember seeing it for the first time and thinking, well, do they mean colored? Well, that's cold. What is that?
They usually colored. Yeah.
Yes. So then when I saw the original, the handwritten one, it's scribbled in exactly, and it's COL''D.
Colored.
But again, I didn't want to assume that was colored. It was different. Sometimes frequently at that time in the 18th century records, they'll say Negro.
And the colored,
yeah. And sometimes
colored too.
Yeah. And they make it nice by saying servant of. Well, you know darn well they weren't. But in amplification, Lee, of what you just asked, that is one of the things that hit me suddenly earlier, last year. Wait a minute. When she stepped off the boat in 84 and then in 91, the minute she stepped off the boat in Boston, she was a free woman.
Question on that?
Yeah.
Okay, so also during the time, it's been a long time, but that used to be like things like doing the slavery and all that, learning my history. At that time also, when slavery was supposedly abolished,
right,
it really wasn't in some point, in some parts. And they came in and had a choice to be, now you're considered indentured servants.
Absolutely.
They came into, like, say, Boston, where it was already, so she was still a slave, but now it's a different title. Because separate in Boston, she was free, supposedly free, even though the process was still ongoing.
Right.
So when she stepped off, when they brought her, she was a slave. And back in those days, it doesn't have to be money. They have a barter system. So it could have been from produce, goods, the cane, whatever he was selling, that he purchased her.
Yes, and I don't, but I know that, yes, I know what you're saying. I don't know. I mean, he bought her once, and then I,
Because he brought her back here. So once he brought her back here, like you said, it was free because the state was free.
right,
But at that time, even though it was
right,
free, they took on a term of indentured service if they decided to stay with the master.
exactly. And again, exactly, right. And that's one of the questions that that keeps you going to dig for more information. If there was time, one time in one of the ledger books that maybe the Mass Historical or something that lists paid Fannie or paid David for blah, blah, blah. The fact also interesting to me is that he was a free man of Boston. He chose to come and live on the Cary farm with the Cary family, with his wife. His wife from Chelsea did not go with him.
Right.
Now, I just for more, and what you're saying is absolutely right. One of the things that I checked with David, our legal advisor on our board, that slavery was not officially abolished in 1780. And I encourage anyone to go on the mass.gov website and the Massachusetts Historical Society website, because particularly this month, there are focuses on Black history and whatever. And that's one of the questions. Well, theory versus practice. Were they free or not? Okay. So this is what I found. 1780, when the Mass Constitution went into effect, slavery was not specified that it was ended. It was still technically legal. And again, the indenture went on, for a long time. But here's the thing where I think she, is free if she chose to fight it. During the years 1781 to 1783, in 3 related cases known today as the Quock-Walker cases, Quock, and then Walker. If you Google that, bing, it comes up. The Supreme Judicial Court applied the principle of judicial review to abolish slavery. And case law, on July 8th, 1783, slavery was effectively abolished. And William Cushing, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, stated, "I think the idea of slavery is inconsistent with our own conduct and Constitution." And this speaks to just what you just said. And this is from the Mass Historical website, I quote, "The legal end of slavery, while individual slaves had successfully sued for freedom and groups of slaves had petitioned for freedom without success, the institution of slavery was not legally abolished until the 1780s in direct response to these cases." Now, and what you said, the Mass Constitution, but as I wrote this down, hoping somebody would ask. In his instructions to the jury before the Quock-Walker case, and there were 3 cases with Quock-Walker because 2 of them were civil cases, because the man that said, "No, excuse me, you're not free," then proceeded to beat him. So Quock took him to court for that as well and won. But the Chief Justice said in his instructions to the jury, and they agreed with him, he stated that slavery was unconstitutional and there can be no such thing as perpetual servitude of a rational creature. Now, absolutely, it ended slavery so that after that point, if you considered yourself free, or you were, and the person that you had worked for or lived on their farm said, "No, I don't think so, Deborah, you're still staying here," the case, it was a precedent then that you were free. Now, of course, you needed the money or to find someone to take your case to do it, but it effectively ended it as a legal situation. But you're right. Slavery was, and again, this is from the Historical Society website, slavery, often recast as indentured servitude, was not unheard of in Massachusetts through the end of the 18th century. And if I may read this, I think this is, again, these are not my words, but they speak to me, and I think they'll speak particularly to what you're saying, if I may. This is from the Mass Historical. This is under the lives of African Americans in Massachusetts after the end of slavery. All was not sweetness and woohoo, let's have fun. Freed slaves, and this is the reality, freed slaves continued in an inferior social position, legally free, but with fewer civil rights than whites. They were treated equally by the legal system, but they couldn't vote. Well, women couldn't either, but they couldn't vote. They paid taxes. Oh, they couldn't serve on juries. They paid taxes, but couldn't vote. In most cases, their children did not attend public schools, prohibited by custom and tradition, if not by law. It was sometimes difficult to find work as a free person. Domestic service remained viable employment along with common labor and professions associated with the sea. But again, speaking to your point, fear of kidnapping and a forced return to slavery elsewhere, was a bar to working on the waterfront. Indentured servitude also remained. African American children were commonly indentured out until they reached the age of 21. Now, white children were also, but it doesn't matter. They had more choices. Free Blacks in the North were continually organizing their communities in hopes of winning freedom for slaves elsewhere and for bringing the benefits of full citizenship to all African Americans. They built community associations that provided mutual support and the foundation for political action, such as the African Society in Boston and the African Lodge of Masons. And that's again, it's free on the web. You can see the scanned, it's from the 1790s, I believe, the African Society in Boston, which met either in what is now the African Meeting House or on that area.
I've seen it.
Yeah, Belknap Street, or what's now Joy Street. That was huge. That was the 1790s. So there was a call to collaborate and say, okay, let's get together and be stronger together. Yeah, it makes my head do that too. It's like, okay, because again, there is the law, and then there is common
people
practice,
law.
isn't there? Yeah,
Right. People's
and
law.
I know a lot of my background is Scottish and from Scotland and Canada, and I know there were people in the 1850s who were Irish, and there was the no Irish need apply, and they pretended to be Scottish.
Right.
Okay, but if you're Black, you can't pretend to be
Because your color, exactly, anybody else.
Switzerland named, Hilda, and no, I mean, so yeah.
Okay.
Fascinating, isn't it? But leaves you with more questions. That's the thing.
And I've often wondered, is that Fannie and David lived where they did because the Cary family, being a major landowner in the area, and Fannie's long, connection, whatever.
Well, they still owned her.
Yeah, it offered some semblance of a protection.
Yes.
That was hard to find in those times.
I agree, Lee, and I think it's more than a semblance. I think you've got the right of it. Absolutely, it was, as it were, the devil, obviously, David Fairweather had a choice because he was a free man of Boston, and he made that choice to not stay in Boston.
Because he wanted to be with his wife, so that's,
Yeah, but I mean, even now, when, a wife is supposed to follow her husband, right? I mean, you know,
Mhm.
you're a team and you should go wherever is best for the both of you. But,
Mhm.
you know, what was it, Ruth in the Bible? With wherever thou goest, I shall go.
It's your mother-in-law, yes.
So yeah, Lee, I think absolutely. I hope that in the letters that are in repositories such as the Mass Historical and different things, somewhere, and whether it's a note or something, there will be a mention of them. I also would like to know where David is buried.
I have another question, Karen.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you think because she was so revered by the family that they figured rather than lose her, they'd give him a job?
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, Fanny, and Tody. And as Lee mentioned, is the work that when Lee presented a play for, I believe it was the second year that the association was involved with the Chelsea Art Walk, that you did the play, Lee. And there again in the Cary letters, which you can read, it's scanned on archive.org. They talked about, the grandchildren talked about visiting Fannie, and what was it, Lee? If you a notice of approbation was if she gave you a feather, was that?
Feather, this was in the family letters. If she gave you, she had a parrot that obviously survived the voyage from Grenada.
Right.
And
You
parrots,
should have pet.
and she loved animals, it's referenced. So she had a parrot, and if she'd like to, she gave you a feather from her parrot.
Right. And you, and also, if I remember, we didn't find anyone who could play a fiddle, but you referenced it, because I know you had written up, we have that in the archives, that I believe it was one of the other servants. Was it Pompey? Or
Pompey
yeah,
was known for playing his fiddle for the
right.
children.
Right. And so, you know, I have as yet found nothing of an indication of where, when the house was taken down. But but it's right on that corner there. And again, the slave house.
Which house taken down?
Fanny's cottage that they mention about go visiting her.
I've always thought that when the three slaves went back to Grenada and Franny stayed, that she just stayed there in the cottage and married David, and that was always the same house.
No, it's not, because in the census, in the census of 1810, he is listed as the head of the household, and there are three other well, how is it listed? Free people of color other than Indians, with a capital I. And so to me, that indicates that it was David was the head of the household, and then Fanny and two other Black people who were, but see, they were not, as she was not, enumerated.
Why would the house have been any different, though? Why would they have moved
well,
to?
I think because that was where, they lived, as it were. You know, you've seen the conjectured plan of the area, and there was a farmer's house like over near John Street, and there was this and that and the other thing. But the fact that the census shows her living with him 1810, and he dies 1850, and then she's living with maybe one or two other people, but then in 1830 She's by herself. And that goes along with the letters that you've read in the Cary letters, that the woman who's writing that to her nephew or whatever writes, my recollections of Chelsea goes back to the 1830s. So if they were just popping down the hill onto what is now Parker Street to Fannie's little cottage, there wouldn't have been room for 4 people. And then the idea that, oh yeah, when she got too frail, we brought her to live with us. Well, I was thrilled when I found the 1840 census. That's not just a fairy tale of white people being nice to a servant. No, she lived in that house for 4 years. So, you know, I don't know where she lived in the house, and I don't know where she died in the house, but I do know that she was one of only 5 people, 4 or 5 people living in the house.
The documentation is always that they had to persuade her. She wanted to remain right where
Yes.
she was. That was a
Yes, when you're absolutely right. When she, again, the letters say that when they came and visited in 1784, and it was for a couple of months, so it was the beginning of 85, Samuel had been unwell and he needed to come to a colder climate to get better. And Mrs. Cary's mother, who was living at Parker Street, wanted Fannie to stay.
right.
And again, the story is, no, if Mrs. stays, I will stay, but I want to go with Mrs. So, you know, who knows? But yeah, you're right. She did stay with them.
I have a question.
And she, yes,
You mentioned that Fannie was literate, which I think is very interesting. Is there any sort of explanation behind, you know, sort of why she was taught to read? Is that just a nice thing, or was it for an occupation or something? Or
again, a fabulous question. I do not know. The only thing I can say is, doing the reading that I've done, it was Mrs. Cary, her mother, Mrs. Gray. And I think it was her nature. Mrs. Cary, her father was a minister, the Reverend Ellis Gray. And Mrs. Gray was pregnant with Sarah when he died of apoplexy. He was a minister. Very nice man. He was only 37. And so she was born a couple of months after her father died. But the word is that her mother, there's descriptions of her. Her mother was a very pious woman, but reading was very important to the Gray family as well as to the Cary family. So I think, David, that one can conjecture that reading was important to her, and I would like to think that Fannie wanted to, and maybe she asked. I mean, obviously, reading and writing, as we all know, is something that we either like it or not. I particularly hated phonics in first grade, but you know, I mean, that was me. So, I mean, it takes work. So I think, I don't know. It would be wonderful if we heard from Fannie. I wanted to read and I did. Who knows? I think it was part of Mrs. Gray's persona as a person. She knew that it was important to be able to read and write. So maybe, I don't know. One of the other questions. What do you think?
no idea.
I have a question.
I'd like to think that though, but sure, yeah.
Thank you. That is my son David being very, very, very blunt and honest, which I love. He never lets me get away with anything. I love it. It's fascinating. Yes, ma'am. Joan.
Yes, so I had a question. So I'm just a little baffled how Fannie's story is told, and it just sounds like such a contradiction to what we've heard in regards to slavery. So she had a symbiotic relationship with the Cary family. She lived well with them. She died there, which speaks volumes. So I wonder what the relationship was as a slave, because we usually hear the horrible history of slavery, and this feels like it's a complete different story of her actually being a part of the family and living with the family, and then marrying and her husband remaining in the family as well, as free. Folks.
Yes, and that's, yes, absolutely. And that's, I cannot tell you with what joy I was filled with, seriously, when I really was comfortable seeing the 1840 census, and there was a free person of color, I forget how they listed, and it had to be Fannie because of the age. It had to be. There was no other one in the neighborhood, so to speak. And it's something that I've learned and remember. I learned it in the 90s with one of my most revered professors, Dr. Emerson Baker. Always look for the primary documentation. Always, always, always. Look for it, try to find it. And so then you have that story of, oh, we loved Fannie, she was so lovely, and we took her into the family, and oh yes, she was lovely, and we treated her like family. Well, that's nice, but is it true? And then to find it in the 1840 census that she's there. So she was there in that house for 4 years. So to be 76 years old and be considered a little too frail, I mean, she only lived, what, 50 feet away, 100 feet away, to come up into the house with the 2 sisters that she'd helped raise. And Charles Cary, who was actually, he was treasurer for the town of Chelsea for a long time, who she also helped raise. So she was brought into the house, and for 4 years. Well, as any one of us who has cared for anybody who's had the sniffles, you know, it can get old caring for someone after a short amount of time. You know, I mean, it can get old to the person who's ill. But to know that she lived in that house and have that factual evidence that supports the story is huge, Joan. It's huge. For 4 years. It wasn't like, oh, she had the sniffles, we brought her in, she had pneumonia and died. No, she was there for 4 years.
Karen, another interesting fact is that according to Rumney Marsh, she had a gravestone.
Yes.
Almost unheard of for the enslaved people buried there. Now, unfortunately, the gravestone has not been seen since the 1930s. Right. And it has an inscription on it, is of African descent. So that also speaks to her significance in the family that they.
Yes, again, Lee, very good point. Yes, you're right. And in fact, if you, again, it's online, the towns in Massachusetts, vital stats before 1850, just about every town, it was a Massachusetts mandate. So if you go, they have births, deaths, and marriages. And again, it's online, but they're bound volumes. And Fannie's, anyway, the births, deaths, and marriages, at the beginning of the volumes, they have the key as to the bibliographic citation, as it were, as to where did we get this information to be listed in the public record. And so hers, after hers, if you look online and see it, after hers, native of Africa, in parentheses, she was 80 years old, died of apoplexy, native of Africa. It reads GR1, and GR1 is the grave record one. So yeah, I'm sure it came from her gravestone, right? Wouldn't that be just faboo if they found it? I mean, the Rumney Marsh Burial Ground Committee is fabulous. They do such incredible work. and again, it's what they do, what I've spent many years of my life doing, what we do is, it sounds funny. Some of my friends say, oh yeah, Karen, she talks to dead people. Well, no, you don't, but history is people. And to me, I mean, yeah, the same things that drove, same things that drive us today. What do we want? For good or bad, we want to be safe. We want to be loved. We want to have a roof over our heads. What makes us angry? Why do we hate? The same, somebody who lived 500 years ago, 200 years ago, they were driven by the same human emotions. So
I have
to
a
me,
question.
the history is real. Yes.
Just a question. The one part that I find interesting, and a question that keeps popping up in my head, is when she was bought as a slave at 8 years, and the fact that it is written from Africa, and it says her age. Are there any indications whatsoever what her real name might have been, even if it's not her last name, even her first name? At 8 years, she probably remembered her real name. And if in Cary family, if at least from their side of the record, if she was beloved, you would think that they would have at least, a natural tendency, human tendency is to ask, oh, what's your name, right? Like, what's her real name? At 8 years old, I would think she would have known. And if there's any indication in any of their letters or any of the documentation that they, where they're describing her, any indication of her, not her slave name, Fannie, but like her real name, or maybe even if they called her her real name by nickname or anything like that?
No.
Okay.
And that is something that I know. I have a friend who years ago adopted a child from Korea, and her name was Joe. I won't say it correctly, but it's Jo Hee was her Korean name. Now they kept that, and she was known to family and friends as Joey, Joie, and they gave her as her Christian name as Joanna, but she was known as Joey, and I'm sure still is today. But that's something that I would absolutely, oh my God, if there's one reason why I didn't want to, I don't have any visuals anyway for this. Hopefully at some time we'll do it, but I didn't want to put a or a daguerreotype of a Black woman because what's the point? That's not right. If we, so perhaps in answer to your question, comment, perhaps her given name by her family sounded something like Fannie. I don't know. If we knew, and as I said to Dakia and I talked about this tonight and spoken about it before, that if we knew, we know about when she was brought over. If we, oh my God, if we knew what tribe she had been taken from, then perhaps that would give it would give a particular language route that we could trace then. How fabulous would that be now? Or a particular physical characteristic. Yeah.
Yeah,
so we'll have to keep digging. That's all.
What I was thinking.
Wouldn't that be fabulous?
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking too. Is even if we had a first name to go by, to even try to trace back, right? Like, I mean, we do know the transatlantic trade. A lot of it, I mean, it says West Africa, but a lot of it happened out of Ghana, right? And those like West African countries. And if there are records in London, I even wonder if records in London kept, if it was to the detail, and not just Fannie, but just in general, if they had kept people's real name and then said what the new, uh, the new name was. But yeah, I mean, just to be able to,
Mm.
I don't know, I think like that's a piece of history that would be very interesting to find out.
Oh, it'd be fascinating. And one of the other things, I mean, it's uncomfortable. Well, I find it uncomfortable to read, but it is a fact. When some of the good websites out there, what you just spoke about, England, Bristol, Liverpool, there are incredible resources online from Britain, from England, that they've documented a lot of that. And some of them have been transcribed. And it speaks to what you just said. It's uncomfortable, but it gives a clue in that they wouldn't have their new name listed unless once they were purchased. But some of the slave registers on the British websites, and also in some letter books and ledgers from Grenada, list what you said, then maybe their African name, they might say African name, but then they also list physical characteristics. And one of the things they mention is a number of them have what they again, this is late 1700s, they'll say tribal marks on face or tribal mark on forearm. Well, someone who knows far more than I about that lineage, that African lineage, that would give them a clue either of a tribe or a particular geographical area. But yeah, it's on there as far as whether they were, what do they call them? A sturdy wench, okay, or thin with one eye bent or something. I mean, they do their characteristics. So,
Karen, I just have a quick question. I'm wondering,
yes, hi.
Hi, I'm Mary Ellen. I'm just, you didn't make any mention of, I mean, I know this is all about Fannie, but is there any other mention of the Cary family having any other slaves or servants as they call them? Because where, if so, did they get them at the same time as Fannie?
That's a great question too. There's no written in the, as far as I know, that day, Samuel was not there to purchase slaves. It was, they were in the market, they went by the area, the sale block that they had humans, and Fannie was there, and Mrs. Cary was just struck by her sad demeanor. Now, having said that, if you look at that, particularly the letter book from Simon Plantation that I mentioned earlier in Florida, if you Google Samuel Cary letter book, boom, it'll come up, and you can see the actual pages. He mentions in that selling and buying individuals. And again, in that context of the late 1760s into the 80s, the terminology is Negroes. He doesn't say workers, slaves, blacks, whatever. He says bought 3 Negroes, or we will have to get 3 more Negroes for the blah, blah, blah. So he does speak of that.
So he does have, and do we know if there were men or women?
Yeah, in some cases you do. I don't have it at the top of my head, which is a good thing, because it would be that's yeah.
I'm just thinking, like if they had 15 children of their own, I'm just not sure how Fannie, being, what did you say, 10 years old, 12 years old by the time
Right.
they came back, if she was going to be, was she the sole, was she taking care of all these 15 kids on her own?
A wonderful question. No, she wasn't. I can't remember all of them, and we don't have the time. But that's another. Their first child was born in '73. That was Samuel. There were about 4 generations of Samuel Carys, which makes it really confusing to do the research. Sam, his father went back to Grenada, but Mrs. Cary, she had the baby in October. They got married in November of 1772 and set up housekeeping, as it were, at the house in Parker Street. She became pregnant and gave birth to her first child in October 1773. Stayed in Chelsea until January and left the child, her infant Samuel, with her mother, which she didn't want to do, her husband didn't want to do, but they felt it was safer for the child. Okay, so they have Sam. And then I have a listing of and if you email us on our webpage, I can send it to you. A couple of years ago, I did a how old was Sam and how old was Sarah when they had all these children, bing, 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 bing. And so Sam stayed in Chelsea for 10 years. So that's one child who wasn't around. The next child was Margaret. And when Margaret was about 7, she went to England to go to school.
Oh.
So yeah, and then 2 of the children, there was a Harriet, she lived 5 months and died in Grenada. And then there was another Harriet that was, so Mrs. Cary was basically pregnant from 19 to about 40. No, seriously, she had 15 children in this time period, which is incredible. I think she deserves a star to have survived 1, let alone 15. So they weren't all at home at the same time.
Yeah.
And I highly encourage anyone, again, if you Google letters of the Cary family, it'll come up, and go to the one that's archived, the website that's archive.org. That is like climbing on the research tree and with a swing, because archive.org is a collaboration between Canadian and American repositories, colleges, private libraries, and it's all free. So if you Google it, it was Lee has seen it, Lee has studied it. It was written by a granddaughter, but it has a lot of the information and it tells you where the children were, and so went to, yeah. So, and I'm sure there were other house servants, as it were. Fannie wasn't the only one, but yeah, the children. I mean, and like Margaret went to England, and then when they came, and then some of the other children were sent here. They were sent there. When they came back to Chelsea, and then in 1795, and this is one of the other things about the Carys that I'd like to share with people, and about the house itself. It may sound naive, but to me, we all call it the Cary house, but the Governor Bellingham Cary house. The bones of that house go back to the 1650s, 1660s, which is incredible. There's been something on that property for all that time. And it was part of this huge farm. And so it still survives. So some people have said, well, it has no relevance. Well, to me, it kind of does, because we as humans have to evolve and change in order to survive. And so the Carys, because of the insurrection, and I'm not saying there shouldn't have been an insurrection, but the Carys had to tighten their belts. Margaret had to come home from England, and Margaret taught her younger brothers and sisters. And the boys went to a Mr. Ticknor's school in Medford. And the Reverend Phillips Payson, who was a minister forever at the church, and it's now just a building, it's not a church, in Revere, they had a small school that they went to. So Cary survived, and like the house has survived. Yes.
Hi, Scortho. I thank you for doing this. As an immigrant myself, I think about sort of the journey people take in.
Hi, Lucy.
Do you?
Sorry, I just found your note. I've been on the laptop. We've got a 2-hour Zoom for the Cary house.
I'm sorry, Jean doesn't realize. Jean?
So,
Yes.
so you sort of chart back her history and think of Fannie. Do you see traces of, do you think she would have tried to trace back her roots and try to find, where she came from or her family or her relatives? It must have been challenging given the financial and economic times of, in the era and just the distances. There's no communications and.
Right. It's very sad, but no, I'm sure she didn't. I don't think at that time period, at that point in time, if you were a human, if you were doing that, that would not have been an option.
Right.
No, I mean, seriously, it wouldn't have been an option. And again, in the Cary letters, because Mrs. Cary leaves in 1774 to go to the West Indies, and kaboom, the whole world explodes. Mr. Cary is captured by the French on some journal, and he's held, and one of the revolutionaries, the free blacks who were, they were going to kill him, and then they said, no, he's a decent man, we'll give him back. The French and English are fighting back and forth. But Mrs. Cary writes that, and the war went on, the Revolutionary War was 1775. It ended by treaty in 83.
Wow, yeah.
So she writes that she has written these letters to people in Chelsea or to her mother or to different people, and they've written back maybe 3 months later saying, don't you like me anymore, Mrs. Cary? I've written you 4 letters. And so she writes, I haven't gotten any letter from my mother in 2 years.
Wow.
So that's why a lot of times you would keep a letter, a copybook. Because say you wrote John Cromwell a letter, how are you? I'm doing this, blah, blah, blah. What's the weather? You write it. And then she doesn't get it for 2 months. And then it takes 2 months for it to come back to you. Your life has gone on. And so if you don't keep a copy of that, you say, well, this is really nice to hear from Joan, but what did I ask her? So I don't think it was, I don't think it was an option, unfortunately.
Thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
One other question. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Oh, if somebody else had a question, go ahead. I can. Oh, I was just going to ask too. Since she could read, and I'm assuming write as well. Was there any kind of written anything like, if not letter, maybe a diary or anything like that that was found from her family, from Fannie's family?
Not that we have found as yet. Again, COVID has, this is a minor problem in the world of COVID, but one cannot go into the Mass Historical Society in Boston and look at the objects that are of the Cary family. Again, I encourage anyone, go on the Mass Historical Society's website and you can see they have a finding aid of the different things that they have, and some of them are the letter book of Margaret Cary, 1829 to 31, or the account book. And Margaret is she was the second child, but she was the eldest daughter, and she really kept things in line. She kind of controlled the household, and so hopefully that's one of the things I would love to do is read that. One can get copies, but there's a fee, obviously. But that would be wonderful to see if there were any record. But as far as Fannie, there may be something, but I have as yet not seen anything that's listed as being authored by Fannie. Wouldn't that be a treat?
So I had a question in regards to
Yes, ma'am.
the Cary couple. I know Mrs. Cary was pretty much pregnant most of her life, and Mr. Cary went off to war. But I was wondering, at some point, were they abolitionists? Because it seems like they were kind-hearted folks and interested in terms of the well-being of Fannie. So I'm wondering if they had any association as being abolitionists, and if so sometimes I've heard that the Cary House was part of the Underground Railroad. So just wondering if you know anything about that.
So far, no. I can say that I have not as yet in the papers that I have read their own letters, some of which we have at the Cary House, and some of which has been printed. There's never been anything indicating anything of an abolitionist nature. The one thing that Mrs. Cary is writing to her son in Grenada in the early 1800s, she died in 1824, 25, I'm having a blank, talking about somebody they knew who was preaching the propagation of the gospel to the heathens, and specifically the Native Americans, the Indians out in the West. And she comments, and again, you get a sense of who she was as a human. She comments to her son, and again, her father was a minister, and she was very devout. She writes something along the lines of, who are we to tell them our God is better than their God? Who are we? Aren't we all made, something along the lines of, aren't we all made in the same form of the Creator? And as though she may have been somewhat open-minded, shall we say? I don't know, but there's never been anything. It doesn't mean there isn't. And in regard to it being on the Underground Railroad, again, I have not ever seen anything specific written about it. Now, mind you, it's not something that one would take copious notes about if you were trying to save people. I do think, and hopefully when we can have people in the house again, I would love to show you. There are two cavities, shall we call it, in the Cary House that people have talked about as maybe where they hid the slaves or whatever. And what happens with urban myths or stories, even old fairy tales from the 1500s, there usually is a grain of truth in them. So I couldn't say no, because we don't know. I will tell you that when you're in the old kitchen, there's a cupboard door. There's a door that goes in, and that has been referred to in the past as the secret chamber where they hid the slaves. Well, I don't mean to be flippant, but there's a window there. And I don't know about you, but if I were hiding for my life, I wouldn't want to hide in a room with a window. Now, we've had some of the young children who visited the house, and it's just fabulous because they want to secret room. And they said, yes, but Karen, the window is how they fed the slaves. But what it actually is, think of if you have a chimney, think of if you have a fireplace in your home or in a building, okay? Maybe 3 feet, maybe 8 feet wide. By the time it comes through the top of the roof, it's small. So it gets smaller, like the neck of a bottle gets. That's where that area is. There's also another area where there was a staircase, and now there's quite a gap. And we have a little opening so you can see it. So that also has been like a secret chamber. Well, it is, but it's just how they reconfigured the stairwell. But again, wouldn't it be wonderful if we found something? Does that help at all?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Wonderful. Good. Anybody else?
And she had 15 children. I'm just wondering, you know, it would be interesting to find out if any of those 15 children and their, like, you know, offsprings are trying to piece some of their history together too, and maybe in conjunction with that, maybe, you know, we might be able to find out more about Fannie, as well as if it was a, um, you know, basically if it was part of the underground, movement. So
Absolutely, and that's the whole thing. When you do research, you have to throw your net wide. You have to have an open mind, thinking where things may be, and they're not always where you think they are, and the answer isn't always what you think. The Cary family is very interesting. They, aside from the fact that there were many of them, one of them, when Sarah and family came back to Chelsea in 1791, she was 7 months pregnant with her next child. I forget his number, Thomas Graves Cary. And he was born in the fall at 34 Parker Street. He married an incredibly wealthy woman. He married a Perkins, and her father, Perkins School of the Blind, her father was just an incredible trader. And his brother married another Perkins family, and they were very wealthy. So, and the Forbes family, the Endicotts, so there very well may be information that someone has written in some other place. That's what, yeah. Who knows? We'll see.
It's Darlene. I don't know. Here, I'm going to get my.
Hi, Darlene.
Hi, there I am. This is so wonderful. The history, Chelsea has so much history, and it goes back to these, you know, beginning times.
Yeah.
You know, with this is so huge, and I'm wondering, you know, where's Ron and Leo in all this? Their family supposedly went back 150 years.
Who?
Where are they right now? Ron and Leo Robinson.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Hi, I hope they're here.
Where are they?
Let's call them out.
That's amazing. I mean, it's just incredible. Lee and I.
She's taking names. Watch out. She's taking names.
Yes, they need to be here because there is a lot of Black, you know, history in Chelsea, and we don't know about it. You know,
no, and
the whole thing with Fannie has got to be. There's got to be information out there, and we've got to find it. It's amazing. It's a wonderful story.
Yeah, and you know,
incredible.
One of the, yes, you're absolutely right. And I mean, you know, we're not pandering about that. I mean, this is real, and this is huge, and there's something about her life story. Lee can attest to this, Lee Farrington, that there's something about this woman that enables her voice to continue to be heard. And I find that really humbling, because why? The other thing with Bellingham, Governor Bellingham, I know we're not talking about him, but he was very interesting for many reasons. But again, with Black history, and that's another thing, a Black man, and this is the 1600s, because Bellingham died in 1672. But anyway, he was coming across from Boston to Chelsea, because he owned it, and Winnissimmet, and almost drowned. And Angola, doesn't have a last name, Angola, who believe he was a free man or he was a servant for someone else. Anyway, he saved him. And Governor Bellingham gave him a plot of land in Boston. Now, again, is this a story? No, it's not a story, because there is a deed that you can access online in the Suffolk Registry of Deeds, one of the first books of deeds from the 1600s. And Bellingham said to him that someone close by said, well, gee, if you're giving out land to Angola, I'll take a bunch. And the quote is that he said, no, Bellingham said, no, you have not done me the service that this man has. So, I mean, yeah, that's
Well,
just.
what was his name?
Angola.
Angola. That's funny. Is that where he came from, maybe?
Yeah. And it was like 50 square feet. I mean, you could trace it now. It was in Boston, Tody, but I'm not, but the fact that, yeah, it's on the record that Angola.
But the story is he saved Bellingham's life. He saved him from drowning.
Yeah, right. And so he gave him land, and yeah, but again, it's having the nuts and bolts finite documentation, the primary documentation that this story really is true. Now, Bellingham didn't live at the house in Parker Street. He visited there. He had a house in Tremont Street, but it's still another black-white historical connection between Boston, Chelsea, the history that is notable. And I mean, you can, again, Google Angola of Boston, and I'm darn sure it'll come up, and you can go right to the deed and see it, which is pretty neat.
Wow. So because this is amazing. And again, when I started saying it was an exciting and it was going to be educational and informative, it was all of the above. So ditto to Da, I completely agree with her. And because I said we've walked around the Cary house for decades and visited the Cary house, but never had a sit-down conversation about the Cary house.
So how are you happy with this? Are you, I mean, we're not debunking anything, we're debunking. How do you feel about it? You happy with it?
I want to hear other folks too, but yes, I am happy with it. And I'm glad we got this opportunity. And I hope we continue the conversation, because there are many, there's a rich Black history here in Chelsea, and Fannie Cary Fairweather is just one of those persons, but it needs to be discussed and conversated and talked about more. So we can relate to the past history of Black folks in Chelsea, and being able to follow that back to the 1700s. Absolutely.
Right. And again, it's not rewriting history, is it? It's sharing it and learning more about it, which I feel amplifies it, and it to you. And I mean, you've heard some of it about Fannie before, but I hope that she has, you know, in a sense, become more real. I mean, this was a real person.
Absolutely.
And you know, we walk in her steps. When I'm in the house, I think, okay, Fannie, where were you? You know, and you know, so it's a journey, and it's wonderful to not be on a journey by yourself. It's wonderful to have others with you, and they notice different things, and you learn from each other, and that's the whole point.
Karen, can I just say, the Cary house would be a great place to have these conversations. You know, historical.
Wouldn't it?
The Cary house is so fantastic, and I don't know why it hasn't been more accessible. Not that it's not, but well, I don't think it is, but it needs to be more present and accessible, and for everyone to come over the bridge to come to that Cary house to hear this history. I mean, this is huge. You know, Chelsea there's so much history here, it needs to be heard. And I think the Cary house would be a great place for that to happen. I hope it could.
Thank you.
So we have another question from Stacy Smith.
Thank you. Yes. Yes, Stacy.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I definitely agree that we need to further discuss this. I found this very interesting. Something that definitely puzzled me was how the Carys could have went over there to the slave block, but weren't there to purchase slaves. Actually, that's something that is a little intriguing, and I would like to know more about that. And also, if they were just looking for people to help them, with household chores and so forth, why wouldn't they have looked closer? Why did they go all the way over there to get those indentured servants or whatever have you?
Right. Well, that's very interesting. And again, the granddaughter writes that they were at the market at St. Kitts. They mentioned that they got Fannie and Grenada. Well, St. Kitts and Grenada are two different places. So, in an answer to your question about the slave market, I don't know. I personally have never been to the Caribbean, so I can't speak to this first person. But I believe, and I may be incorrect, but I believe that the slave market was, as I find it so unpleasant to say, but that was a part of the area that was of commerce. So it would have been I believe, a portion of the market, but just a section of it. So if someone can speak to that, that would be wonderful.
Well, Karen, there were a lot of like my family's Jamaican,
right?
And they're certainly part of that whole trade route, and for the sugar and everything. So I mean, Grenada, St. Kitts probably all had bits and pieces that were involved with the slave trade.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, and then the markets, because have you been to Grenada, Tody? I know you've been to.
No, I've been to Jamaica a lot. Jamaica.
I know, it's family there, yeah. So where was the slave? If I'm sure because now they have their international heritage sites in many different places, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Where was the slave market?
Well, I just read a book about it, and it would have been Kingston, parts of Kingston, because that's where the harbor was, or still is, actually.
So would that be where the human beings were being sold? Right, would be near the waterfront, right? And
yeah, well, I would imagine, yeah.
Yeah, and would that be perhaps near where other things were sold? Or would it be totally separate?
No, that I don't know, but I would imagine it would have been in a market where people are coming and going, and I mean, because you want it's like having a shop window. You want the best venue.
Right, exactly.
Sad to say, but it's true.
I know. It is.
I mean, it's fascinating to think that they bought her like kind of on a whim, as she walked by and said, "Oh, I feel bad for her, and let's take her." Like it was some kind of a that's what I find very disturbing. It's in addition to the whole thing, but I mean, just the fact that they weren't, like you said, if it was true that she was walking through the market and buying other things, and then she saw this young girl. I mean, that's just
something's not adding up.
It's very disturbing, and what also when one reads again, it's disturbing, it's uncomfortable, but it's the reality when one looks at inventories of estates and all over. I mean, I've seen it countless times. When someone has died in the 1700s or whatnot, and they have to have an inventory of their estate, the taxes, and we have to do probate now, and the whole reason is you have inconvenienced the state by dying and losing your income. Well, the unfortunate reality is that palatable reality is that when they list things, you frequently can tell what room the assessor is in because of what they're listing, beds or pots and pans. Frequently, the humans, the slaves, are listed with the farm implements and the cattle and the commodities.
Oh my God.
It's I mean, it's heartbreaking, but that is the grim reality of that, and you know, I mean, it is real. And some of them.
It's interesting that I just read this book on Jamaican wills because a lot of the documents were lost in earthquakes, fires, and stuff.
Right.
But they still had wills, and the slaves were like 3 dishes, you know, this much silver, 4 human beings, you know, and they would then left in their will to maybe to their daughter or their sons, and very, very seldom got their freedom. They just were bequeathed to someone else.
Because they were a commodity, like.
They were commodity, they weren't human. And I mean, she may have bought that little girl because it's almost like buying a pet.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
This is incredibly, and that's, I'm glad that we've come to this conversation because, and that's why I said, wow, it just sounds so beautiful that she was compassionate and felt sorry for this little girl that was on the slave block. And you've never heard that type of a story. So, and when Stacey said, you know, it's hard to believe, because we would say, you know what, it sounds like, you know, she bought this little girl if she did pay, but it's just a conversation that because in respect to time, it's getting close to 8, and this shows that we need a second virtual event to continue this discussion and conversation.
Anytime.
I do want to leave it open for one last question. I see that Beverly was trying to ask a question.
Yes, I was trying to ask this question.
Hi, Beverly.
Hi. And you know what? I have been watching on old channel. It's called Underground.
Yeah.
And we talked about was this underground, you know, we were all asking and wondering, was there this was this underground, could slaves come through there?
Yeah.
And you kind of touched on that a little, okay?
Yeah.
But to me, the Carys, you know, just like the lady said, you know, we were like, when they bought the slaves, they were like puppies. They were like, you know, like perching a puppy or something. And it just doesn't sit well with me.
No, you're absolutely right.
This whole, you know, I'm glad we had this dialogue tonight, but this whole thing is not sitting well with me. You know, around the whole Cary, you know, being and everything. And I really, really want to take a visit to the house and see the rooms that you said, where they said there was a window and there was, you know, where could they go? And, you know, I mean, there's been a myth so long that that was like an underground place for slaves to come to. And now we're hearing a different dialogue. So, you know, I really want to know.
Well,
I look into this deeper.
Beverly, I absolutely, I love it. I love it. And that's the whole point. Maybe they were at the slave house. Maybe they, and who knows? And that's what makes this so fabulous, is that it's a conversation that, and yes, you're right, it's incredibly uncomfortable. It's just incredibly uncomfortable. And but it is the historical narrative. The only thing, and it does no good for the people who came before us, but it is the way that it is no longer.
Yes. Can I say something?
Yes.
My feeling, I feel like it's too bad that it's here we are in 2021.
Yeah.
This stuff should have been in 100 years ago in his you know, history. This is our history. This is what we did. This is what we went through.
Right.
You know, if this had been addressed 100 years ago, we'd be in a different situation, I think.
Yeah.
Here we are bringing up these amazing stories. I think of Frederick Douglass and what he went through, and wow, if we had heard that a long time ago in our history books as children,
that's right,
we'd be somewhere very different now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it is what it is, but that's just what my heart says now. That's all.
I agree with you. And this isn't to make it any less painful, the past any less painful. However, we do have a platform that was unimaginable 100 years ago, 20 years, 40 years ago, that we can tell this story. We can put it on the web. We can remember her name. We can learn from each other and help to make it better. It's all we can do. It's all we can do.
It is true. It's true.
You know, but thank you for that. I absolutely
think like, oh.
What? What,
I can't help but think, oh.
Karen, I do thank you.
I know.
I'm not browbeating you, but I'm just like, you know.
No, don't. I don't know. This is
excellent.
And you're not browbeating me. I don't feel browbeaten. Honest to God. It's part of the conversation, and that's the fact that we can have the conversation is glorious.
We need it.
It's the only way we can move forward. I mean, and when we can once again visit, have the Cary House open. I mean, small volunteers. No, we have a small group of volunteers. We do not have any staff, whatever. We're not meeting there. We're meeting remotely via teleconferencing. But I'm telling you, I mean, you know, we will have parties, and it's very important to all of us. We may not each have 15 children to bring to the party, but we can all walk in that door and be welcome, because that's very important.
All right.
Pardon?
That's why we can have the party, because we don't have 15 children.
So that's absolutely a date for all of us here post-COVID. We will set up a trip to the Cary House, as we did in elementary school, but as adults, because inquiring minds do want to know, and there's still many unanswered questions. So I absolutely, CBC will be following up with Karen and the board at the Cary House to set up something, and hopefully post-COVID, as close as next year during Black History Month. I think this is a great idea. Thank you.
To say again how I'm very cognizant of this. To me is momentous. Yes. You and I have spoken about this, and it's an opportunity that I'm just so happy to be part of. And it's, you know, not every conversation, and I don't feel browbeaten at all. I mean, I cannot say that I share that history, but doesn't make it any less of a humanity issue for me. So the only thing we can do is be welcome now, and we're so honored as a group to be part of this. I'm so glad. And I thank you all. I thank everyone who participated. And if you didn't get a question now, you can always send it to the Cary House and then come and visit. We'll have more than one party when we can.
Absolutely.
We'll drag Toady back from from Portugal. So I can show you some of her gorgeous work.
This was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, it was.
This was really, really good. And I just want to say real quickly, my takeaway from the story wasn't the traditional horrible experience that we're so used to when we hear stories of slavery and stories of how things used to be in the past. I think that the fact that you can get so much detail about this woman's life through other people's letters is a testament of how revered this woman was to the Carys. You know, so it wasn't totally negative. I mean, it's good to know that side. There's, you know, like one example of that sort of relationship that people had with their slaves and with the indentured servants. So it wasn't totally negative for me. It was actually refreshing to hear that, you know, one person, the Cary family, did have reverence for this woman, and you didn't hear from this woman at all. This was extracted from the letters that they had written to each other. So that just goes to show that this wasn't a total negative slavery story that we're so used to hearing, and it was a very positive story.
Right.
So this is a fair statement from me, if possible. I would just like to say what Karen has taught us tonight is something that we should be doing ourselves also. Before my grandmother passed in Mississippi in 2011, I had her to sit down and go back as far as she could and list all of her relatives. And you know what? Everybody that she gave me, I tracked them through Ancestry.com. She was exactly right. I think it was the 1865, 1860 census. Really? They were right. And from there, I'd gone back one generation that she didn't know about. So it's so important that all of us try to trace our own backgrounds also. So that's and this just encourages us to do this, what you've done tonight, Karen.
Thank you.
And
Because
Karen,
you all responding to this encourages me. It's a quest. It really is. And there's something, and Lee can testify to this, there is something about Fannie Fairweather that he wants her voice to be heard, and we are all facilitating that. And it's a good thing in a world where there aren't always good things.
Yes.
Thank you.
I think that Fannie Fairweather was way before her time, because she lived a life. Say again. She lived a life that late Congressman John Lewis lived by, which is get in good trouble, and she stayed in good trouble. But she, you know what I mean? So I think to sum it all up, her life was way before good trouble is good to be in. So thank you again, Karen, for your knowledge and conversation tonight.
Thank you. I'm honored to be part of this, and you know, we don't have all the answers, but that's part of the journey.
And I think as to piggyback off of what Rochelle said, that we're so used to hearing a different story, that for you to shed light on an individual that had a different experience with slavery and actually was taken in and part of a family is just a different conversation about slavery. So I thank you for basically sharing that with us, to know that it wasn't all a hard life and sadness and torture, that this actually is documented through the letters. So I thank you for sharing that with us, Karen. And we have 3 minutes left. So I'm glad all of you came into our home this evening, and we had some healthy conversation, discussion, and definitely walking away a little smarter in regards to the Bellingham Cary House and Fannie Cary Fairweather. So thank you for joining us this evening. And I just want to re-invite you to our next event, which is February 10th, and that's next Wednesday, same time, same place. It's Silent Beats, and it's a short film discussion on assumptions and stereotypes. And it's great because it's going to show us how to reduce unconscious stereotype beliefs about Blacks and Brown people. And it also helps us to explore implicit bias within all of us. So please join us next Wednesday, same time, same place, same
Good topic. Good topic.
Thank
you. Bye-bye. Have a good night.